Hello and welcome to this afternoon's keynote event. My name is Anthony Sis, and I'm the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Learning Consultant in the Department of Inclusion and Workforce Diversity here at Cornell University. I'm thrilled and delighted to introduce Dr. Dana Crawford for her presentation on Turning Awareness into Action, Reduction of Bias, Prejudice, and Racism. Before we start, I'd like to read Cornell University's land acknowledgement. Cornell University is located on the traditional homeland of the Gayoconyo, also known as the Cayuga Nation. The Gayoconyo are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayoconyo dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayoconyo people, past and present, to these lands and waters. I will now introduce Dr. Dana Crawford. Dr. Crawford is a pediatric and clinical psychologist. She is a graduate of Howard, Temple, and Miami universities, and has degrees in African American Studies, Education, and Psychology, and a certificate in nursing. She is also a scholar in residence in Columbia University's Zuckerman Institute. Finally, she is the developer of the Crawford Bias Reduction Theory and training and serves as a cultural bias consultant with organizations across the U.S. Dr. Crawford?
Thank you so much. And I just have to say, starting this presentation with honoring the land of Cornell is the type of action that I think is really critical. Also, I just want to thank everyone for attending today. Not just because, obviously I want you to come to my talk, but I recognize that these spaces that we're navigating these days are really time impoverished. And time is one of our most precious commodities. And so my hope is that in this hour today, I can give you some resources that really help move this work forward. In the spirit of disclosure and honoring the land, I think it's critical that we start these conversations with a bit of disclosure. How many of us have gone to so many diversity trainings or just trainings in general, and we actually don't know much about the person who's sharing information and knowledge and where they acquired it and their journey through knowledge and learning? And so I start with, I have no financial disclosures or conflicts of interest. And then I share my disclosures of how I enter this conversation. Number one, I enter it as a Black woman, and you might look at me and go, duh, obviously I know you're a Black woman. However, I disclose that because I invite you to move away from looking at someone and assuming you understand their journey. The second is I enter it as a descendant of enslaved people, not slaves. Instead, my ancestors were enslaved. Something happened to them, and they were much more than slaves. They were enslaved people. And I inherited resiliency from them. We talk so much about the trauma, historical trauma, but we don't talk enough about historical resiliency. And the very cells that I have in my body are the cells of survivors. I'm a cis woman. I'm a first-generation college student. I'm a woman of a Black man with a mother who is white. However, he identifies as a Black man. I'm the mother of 2 Black children, and I'm raising them in the heart of Harlem. And lastly, I enter this conversation with acknowledgement of the privilege of being academically educated and the recognition that there are many, many people who are probably a billion times smarter than me, yet did not have access to the resources of a formal education. And so I honor and I want to amplify many ways of coming to knowledge. And in that spirit, throughout this presentation, I will be using QR codes. QR codes, if you're not familiar with them, are those little black and white, it's a little black and white box in the corner. It looks like a barcode. And depending on the type of phone you have, all you're gonna do is open up the camera feature of your phone and point it at the screen at that black and white box. And it's gonna look as if you're taking a picture and a little link will come up. And this link is for the website dosomething.org. And I use QR codes for a variety of reasons. Number one, I use them because I've gone to so many trainings and I say, I'm going to look something up later, and then I don't. And then I'm like, oh, what was that resource? Or I want the slides and then I don't have access and then I'm waiting. And so QR codes are a really great opportunity for me to just make the information accessible to you right now. The second reason is, academic knowledge has often been worshipped in this country, especially when we talk about racism, specifically bias and prejudice in general. And what can happen is as people are describing and explaining their experience, their lived truth, others ask for substantiation. What is the evidence? And so although I will be using QR codes from the academic space, I will also be using communal knowledge. And that looks like knowledge from social media. That looks like websites like dosomething.org, to really honor the many different ways that are going to be required for us to come to changing this world that we live in. So how does one begin a conversation like this? At this point in my career, I have hundreds, I would dare say thousands of hours of these types of conversations. And sometimes they are beautiful and they're loving and they're so saturated with humanity. And other times they crack me open. They break my heart. And so when I was thinking of this talk, it's a wonderful opportunity to talk about a call to action. But where do I start? Where do we begin? Action. So I just said, I can't start with one type of racism because racism is everywhere. It's threaded throughout the quilt of our life. And, when I say racism is everywhere, it's in academic inequity. It may be in the academic space for universities, all the way to preschools and thinking about preschool kids in the state of New York, constituting 18% Black children, constituting 18% of preschools, but 40% of expulsions in preschool. Or even in the high school level, and you just think about access to extracurricular activities and the ways that young people don't even have the same experiences of enjoying their education like maybe we did, depending on your age. It shows up in hiring and promotion and who gets hired, what is professionalism, who gets promoted, for what reasons, how do we measure success and academic rigor. It comes up in business loans, who gets what loan, what small businesses are supported. It shows up in our religion and things as horrific as church shootings, and you can just decide what decade to think about that. It shows up in our COVID-19 deaths. Who were the essential workers, and what did the majority of them look like? It shows up in our legal system, and I dare not call it a criminal justice system. I would say the criminal legal system. And it shows up in our housing. Who lives in what housing? Who has access to what type of living experiences? The playgrounds, which playgrounds are clean? So just pick a topic and racism will show up. It's a thread. And so as I think about where we are right now in this society, we are on the high of what I call a cultural consciousness wave. And these waves happen so many times in our humanity. And so, most recently it's Dante Wright. Last summer it was Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and so many names I can't even remember, honestly, sometimes. Before that, it was Eric Gardner. Before that, it was Mike Brown. Before that, it was Emmett Till. Before that, I'm sure it was a before that. And so when these cultural consciousness waves happen, there are times in our history, specifically in our country, where we recognize that things are wrong and racism is terrible and it's gotten out of hand and the world stops, or the media gives the full attention and we all decide, you know what, we need to do something. And what do we do in the workplace? In our own lives and our families and our communities, we may engage in community activism and more conversations. But what happens at work? The solution for all the ways that the world breaks our hearts and racism shows up and is threaded in everything is more training and more diversity, right? We need to hire more diversity. We need to do more trainings. And so the traditional approaches to diversity training have, some fundamental problems. The first is othering. So you go to these trainings and if, it's a class that you took in grad school, you open up the textbook, or if it is an in-person or virtual training, you get an agenda and it says things like how to work with African-American students, how to work with Asian and Pacific Islander patients, how to work with LGBTQIA customers, how to work with Muslims. But there's never a chapter on how to work with white people. It's never a chapter on how to work with white men specifically. And so what that does is it creates the space that whiteness is assumed to be the norm and everything else is other to be understood. It other rises everyone else. The next piece is you typically go to these trainings and it positions people who have experienced some level of oppression, usually some lovely Black woman in a white dress with dreadlocks, right? Some person with a marginalized identity teaching these classes, teaching, facilitating these workshops. And often what that leaves is the space becomes very white-centered, or the space becomes a space that we don't explore what it means to have intracultural racism. What does it mean to have racism amongst people of color? So what does anti-Blackness look like in the Dominican community? What does internalized racism look like in Native communities, where we're really exploring our own racialized traumas? That's not really happening in the workplace when we think about DEI. The next is whiteness as a concept. Goes underexplored. And I specifically like the term white toxicity rather than white supremacy, because I don't find anything to be supreme about white supremacy. And I think the term in itself perpetuates white supremacy by even calling it that. But the concept of what is whiteness? What does it mean? What is this historical thing that we've seen over centuries? What is this thing and how do we define it? The next is many of these trainings, you do asynchronistic learning, and it talks about awareness, and you learn more, and it becomes a DEI 101 of sorts. And then what? And then the last piece is this language about anti-racism being an endless journey that we'll never arrive at. And it's a bit of a road trip without a clear destination. And so this approach that we are always learning doesn't honor the foundation of the academy, which is for us to have some outcomes, to have some measurable changes. We actually have to have some standards and measurable destinations and an ability to check in to see if we arrive there. And the other piece that you start to see as the world evolves is, it used to be just diversity. Now it's like DEI. But for many institutions, for many spaces, we're still talking about diversity. And when I think about diversity and hiring for diversity and recruiting diversity candidates, whatever that means, I don't have on my CV diversity candidate, and I don't know who would label me as such based on what standard, and would they say it to my face? That's the big question. When I got hired, we're so happy to have you as a diversity hire, right? And so it already creates a problem in just that language. But let's say you're recruiting for diversity. It's the equivalent, of saying, you know what, I want to have a really fancy dinner party. And I want to invite everyone because I'm so, I want everyone to come from all over the world. I want the smartest, most interesting people. And I don't even consider their dietary needs. I don't think about the seating arrangements. I don't even think about, maybe I'm on a 6th floor walk up, how they're getting to my apartment if their body is able to do that. I don't even clean my house. I don't get my house ready. I just want them to come. I don't think about what are the things that I need to do before they arrive to support their experience. And so it's so cool that maybe you could organize and be a department that gets diversity. But who wants to come to your party? Who wants to come where they're not considered? And your house is dirty. And you're not really thinking about anyone else's needs but your own. And so instead, the call to me of the next level of action is diversity, equity, inclusion, of course, but also belonging. Because in truth, none of us are inviting someone to a dinner party. None of us need to be recruiting for diversity because, in fact, this is not your house. It's all of our houses. And to start to conceptualize DEI with the DEIB means to have a perspective of I'm moving you in the same way that I would move in a spouse. The way I would move in a child, I would adjust my furniture. They would have a room. They would have space. I wouldn't say like, oh, well, let me get what you need. No, it would be like literally make yourself at home. The same way I would bring an elder into my home. And that's what DEIB means. It means recognizing that all of our institutions, all of our departments are ours and not one person's, not one group. But what does it really mean to create belonging? What creates belonging? What lets someone know that they are part of this space and they have ownership of the space. I have to start to think about this in the sense of whenever I feel disoriented, I'm a scholar, so I snuggle up to a book, and research is me search. And so what my research really has helped me understand are the ways that people don't feel connected. These experiences for me have happened throughout my life. They've happened to everyone throughout their lives because it's a thread, but I'll start with my training in small town USA. So I trained in Oxford, Ohio, when I was learning how to be a psychologist in the cornfields of America, surrounded by corn and llama farms. I didn't even know llamas had farms. I grew up on the East Coast and then moved to the Midwest. And as I was starting to pursue and build relationships as a pediatric and child psychologist, I worked in many different settings. But what I found is really, I think pediatric psychologists, mental health professionals that work with children are some of the most compassionate, loving people. And yet, racism was still there. More specifically, these are some quotes that I started to hear as I was navigating the clinical space. The first is I was doing this dating violence prevention group called Expect Respect in this middle school for middle school girls. And we were striving to teach them what it looks like to have healthy dating relationships. And so the group was called Expect Respect. Like, these little middle school boys better respect you, girl. And so we're like having fun and talking about like dating and, oh my gosh, she's so cute. You know, all that fun, loving stuff that's middle school. And I get called to the principal's office, and the staff are there, and they say, Dana, you know, we're worried about your group. We don't think the kids can understand you. And I said, oh, is it too developmental? It's not developmentally appropriate. And, you know, something happening with the content. And they said, you know, we're worried the kids can't understand you because of your Jamaican accent. Now, if you've noticed, I don't have a Jamaican accent. I'm not Jamaican. I've never been to Jamaica. Some would accuse me of being Jafakan, but I'm definitely not Jamaican, although I love all things Jamaican culture. But what was fascinating about this is because I have my hair in dreadlocks, because of my skin, they create an entire cultural identity about who I am based on my appearance. The next thing is, you know, as you can tell, I'm pretty engaged. I'm pretty passionate. I wake up like this. It's 2:00 in the morning. I'm like, what's good? You know, I'm always hyped. And so when I would be in the classroom, especially as a first generation college student, the first person in my family to get a doctorate, I'm passionate. I moved my whole life to go to the Midwest, and I would ask about certain terms and reflect. And my colleagues would do the same, my white colleagues. And I would get the feedback that I just seemed so angry and aggressive. And I didn't feel either. The other thing is, I would say as a psychologist, one of the most intimate relationships you can build is therapy. People tell me things that they've never told their own parents and their loved ones. And I would build this intimacy, especially when you think about pediatric psychology. This is people's parenting. That's an intimacy, to be vulnerable in that way. And I would get comments from my patients after this deep level of connection, like, oh my gosh, my therapist is such a pretty Black girl. You're so pretty for a Black girl. And then the last piece is I was doing this group in Cincinnati. It was at 8 a.m. It was in a residential, like, juvenile detention center for teenage boys. And they wanted me to do a group at 8 in the morning where teenage boys talked about their feelings at 8 o'clock in the morning. In other words, I was set up, right? Like, what? This group is already doomed for failure. And I went to my supervisor and I said, I'm having a really hard time connecting with the kids. I don't know if it's because, you know, the group is so early. I don't know if it's because these kids are from the Midwest and I'm so East Coast. I don't know nothing about this Midwest. I don't know if it's gender. And my supervisor interrupted and said, oh no, it's because you're not like a real Black person. You're not, you know, like Black, like our patients. And all of these experiences were within the confines of a beautiful relationship, people I cared about, people I connected with, people that were great intention, but yet it made it clear that I did not belong. Maybe diversity was supported, but definitely not DEIB. And so, you know, people might say that wasn't anyone's intention. No one intended to let me know that I didn't belong, that I wasn't part of that household, that it wasn't my household. And people would say things like, oh, you took it the wrong way. I didn't mean it that way. You took my words out of context. No one else was offended. You're being too sensitive. And so all of these intentions. And so, you know, the thing about intentions, it focuses a lot on the person who is doing the hurting and not necessarily on the person who has been hurt. And so we know that these intentions are not sufficient in dismantling racism, right? And I'm going to breeze through this because I want to get into some action. We know these intentions are insufficient because we look at the horrific statistics. And again, racism is everywhere, so I'll just pick some. You know, first, we think about some of the most vulnerable humans, newborn babies. In the United States, Black babies are 3 times more likely to survive if their doctor is Black. and they're 3 times more likely to die if their doctor is white. And so in this image, what I see is a couple of things. Number one, I see a sweet little baby boy that looks so much like my yummy little boy. But I also see this beautiful white woman who looks a lot like my friends and the people I went to school with. And if she's anything like my friends and the people I love and the people I went to school with, and the people I work with, she didn't go to medical school to let Black babies die. She didn't sacrifice all those years and study and get all those student loans, honey, to let Black babies die. But yet it happens. How? Why is this the case? You know, it also has to do with the ways that we understand bodies of color, specifically Black bodies. You know, just a recent study in 2020, we've seen that medical trainees perceive Black people as having less sensitive nerve endings than white people. And so the dehumanization that goes into this process of not perceiving someone else's body as being able to experience pain in the same ways, what is happening? And so when we say things like Black Lives Matter, what we're talking about is pain being ignored. But this is not, you know, right now we're amplifying because we know the bodies that are most at risk because of certain systems. But I would dare say this issue is bigger as a humanitarian issue, because I see it in many other spaces of marginalization. Queer pain is being ignored, woman pain, the pain of people who have experienced impoverishment, religious pain. You know, it's Ramadan right now and the ways that Islamophobia is persistent in this country, neurodivergent pain, and the ways that workplaces are not even accessible. In short, when people are othered, pain is ignored. And so what I would dare say, when we talk about racism specifically, bias and prejudice in general, it is a humanitarian emergency. And a humanitarian emergency is something that threatens the health, the safety, the security, the well-being of a community or a large group. I think in America, we have a humanitarian crisis related to racism. And it is expanding in bias and prejudice. And so the reason it's important to make such declarations like racism is a humanitarian crisis, racism is a public health crisis, is because then it focuses on systems rather than placing these inequities within the individual. It shifts if we're thinking about the workplace and we're asking questions about who is a diversity hire and how do we get them, and we can't get the right people. We recognize this is a systems issue, not an individual fault issue. And we know that this history is crucial and it's seeped in every aspect of our society, every institution. And so, you know, Crawford bias reduction theory and training, CBRT, and I promise you I did not name the theory after myself after narcissism. It has to do with 2 things. We know that by eponyms, the ways that theories become named, that typically women name their theories after concepts, and men name their theories after themselves. And I'm a Black woman who's a theorist. And so the very notion of naming my theory after myself, after a Black woman, is an intervention in itself, but it makes me cringe. It's so cringy, so I just say CBRT. And what CBRT is really about is 3 core concepts. 1, awareness. Awareness of racism as a socially transmitted disease that we all spread to each other. An awareness of the individual triggers and the coping reactions we have and the truth of having this STD. The next is an investigation, and it's an investigation of the individual, interpersonal, and institutional manifestations of bias, prejudice, and racism. And lastly, it's about reduction. How do we engage in authentic, value-driven, mindful behaviors so then we can engage and make sure that we're changing systems? Letup is a mnemonic for how you do that, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And so racism as a socially transmitted disease, as an STD, it recognizes that through our social media, through our relationships, through our community, through our institutions, there are stories that are sold and purchased. And what I mean by that is it's all the ways that we believe the images that we receive without really investigating, without interrogating what we really believe. And so, you know, the truth is racism is a tool. It's a tool to determine resource needs. And that specifically is about race. You know, who needs what resources? Who gets what resources? How are these resources going to be generated? And how do we control these resources? And I say that because race is not real. You know, racism is a tool and say, oh, I'm going to sort people based on their social categories by race. You could use any social category. You could do height. You could do language. And we do, depending on the country that you're in, depending on the environment that you're in, there are many different social constructs to determine and generate resources. And we know that race isn't real, but, and when I say not real, I mean related to the Human Genome Project. 20 years ago, we knew that wasn't real, that race wasn't real, but it has very real social ramifications. It has very real biological, educational, medical, because, and spiritual, and many other ramifications, because it has to do with resource distribution. And I say that race isn't real because depending on what country you're in, your race literally could change, right? Depending on your skin tone, depending on your hair texture, things of this sort. And so really, when we talk about race as a resource, it's really a human resource. And the human resources that we have as commodities are our time, our energy, our health, our motivation, our intelligence, our labor, our relationships. These are all the resources that help us generate things in the world, that help us generate products which our workforces, even universities, need. And so when we talk about understanding race from the concept of a resource, we have to look at the concept of whiteness. Whiteness is the human resource manager. And specifically what I mean is whiteness is used to determine what is appropriate, what ways we should be behaving, what is appropriate in terms of affect, behavior, the ways that people think, and it determines who gets resourced and who gets harmed if they don't meet the standard of whiteness. And that standard of whiteness, even some white people can't live up to it, you know, especially when we think about the intersectionalities of whiteness and social economic status. And so white toxicity, the byproduct of whiteness as a standard, is a toxin for all of us. It impacts all of us because one group shouldn't be the standard if our goal is innovation. One group should not be the standard if our goal is to maximize our resources. One group can't do that. Everybody brings a different resource, and that's critical that we're able to recognize that. And so the power that is associated with whiteness is because resources are critical for survival. You need a paycheck, right? And questioning resources activates all of our fear. More specifically, these are the big existential fears. And next to it, you see the different types of ways that those manifest in the world. So all humans have vulnerable bodies. Nobody's a Terminator here. And because of that, we have like the fear of, for example, of being harmed, that something could happen to our bodies. And so because race is used as a resource generator, we intersect that fear of harm with race. And you see things like Black on Black violence as narratives to control, generate, and teach the socially transmitted disease of racism. You also see this related to other groups, and you see things like what would happen if we had gender neutral bathrooms. Fears of not having enough, things like job stealing come up. Fears of extinction, that our people, your group will not continue. I remember in the late 90s, conversations about how the Latinx community would become the majority. And fast forward to last year, and you see things like forced hysterectomies through ICE. You see things like forced birth control in many different populations and the ways that people are educated about their reproductive rights. And there are many different things that I can go through and talk about these big existential fears. And here are some QR codes if you want to read more. But I invite you to avoid intellectualizing here, because how much is the big picture, the theoretical, impacting your day-to-day life when we talk about resources and we talk about fears? I want to talk more about the resources and fear that are related to all of that history and your professional identity. So somehow, in some way, we believe that we could live in this world with all of this socially transmitted disease of racism, prejudice, and bias, and then come to work and poof, our professional identity magically negates all of that social learning. Actually, the very notion that we think we could don some type of cover and become this professional identity actually makes us more vulnerable to issues related to racism and power, because we need things specifically from that system. What I mean more is about this investigation of looking at the individual, interpersonal, and institutional manifestations of these fears, of these resources as they relate to racism. And so some of the workplace resource and fears as you think about engaging this work of being a bias reductionist, of being an anti-racist, the things that I hear people say when they have to really think about confronting institutional and systemic racism, fears around money and funding. Who gets what money? That's a resource. Reputation and prestige. What are people going to say about me? What happens if my department chair doesn't like what I say? What's going to happen when I go up for tenure, or I need evaluation, or I need annual review? How will that show up? What if I can't get hired? I can't get a good letter of recommendation, or what if I won't be promoted? I'll be stuck in this position because of the ways that whiteness is a standard. If I don't meet those standards, if I don't perform in those ways, if I don't show up in those ways, what will happen? And so in turn, that same resource cycle of determining resources based on whiteness gets perpetuated. And lastly, I mean, how many of us are petrified of conflict in the workplace? Like, who wants beef? Nobody wants to be fighting with their coworkers, right? And so one of the things that I have people do when we think about putting action to our awareness is this fear and resource investigation, or I like to call it the FAR, where you really reflect on these questions. When you think about individual racism, prejudice, and bias, what are you afraid of losing? So you all did this asynchronistic learning. Some people have, done other work and gone to workshops, but yet I hear constant narrative of like, I don't know what to do next. Often there's a gut feeling within you of what passion you have in this work. And that work may be in a school system, that might be in your department, that might be, farming. You can literally look at racism in farming. Like wherever you are, there's some racism for you to dismantle. But really thinking about what keeps you from doing that. And so pondering, what are you afraid of losing? And what will you gain? Interpersonally. So many times we have, instances of microaggression that show up, and some things are very explicit racism, prejudice, and bias, and people say nothing. They sit on the Zoom and then they mute themselves, or there's a public rupture, there's a public wrong, and what do? We offer private support. Let me private chat this person, like, I'm so sorry that person said something. Let me go by your office and say, hey, I didn't think that was fair in that meeting. So we offer private support for public humiliation. And what would it mean interpersonally for you to step up? What would be the worst case scenario if you said something? And what would be the best? And then institutionally, there are so many things that I imagine you see within your department, within your role, that are not about DEIB. What keeps you from standing up, saying something, getting involved? What's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? And I invite you to take a picture of this screen and really sit down and journal and ask yourself these real questions. And the reason this is so critical is because this will drive your ability to have action and not just awareness. For me, this work, I've done for years, but still, I always discover new ways that racism shows up uninvited. I never get a calendar invite. It just shows up at my house. Like, what are you doing here? And it's so embedded. A few months ago, at the end of 2020, I was in this meeting, and it was a mostly white space. It was a very high, national meeting, big funders, big checks. And it was mostly white people and this Black woman. And this Black woman was so authentic in her expression, in her affect, in her behavior, in the way that she expressed herself. She was so blackity black. I was like, what? I did not expect it. So then after the meeting, I sent her an email and I was like, I really appreciated your authenticity in the meeting. And she said, you mean how I was so Black and I didn't code switch? And I said, yeah. And she said, Dana, they killed Breonna Taylor in her sleep. What's code switching going to do to save your life? And I started to think about that. And at the time, my understanding of code switching was very much anchored in, very naive thoughts of thinking about the standard of whiteness and the impact of white toxicity as the ways that people speak. But it's so much more. It's at the heart of it. It's this demonstrated, this need to show my competence. in everything that I do and the ways that I express. It's when I get on the Zoom and people say, "How are you doing?" And then I go, "Oh, I'm good," right? Toxic positivity. It's the ways that when people even attempt to say, "Hey, do you need a day off?" And I go, "No, because I got to be strong because I need to demonstrate that I belong." And so I made it my New Year's resolution in 2021 to stop code switching. And I tell you, it's been a journey. And what I've seen in it is sometimes people are more vulnerable, more honest, more truthful about their fears and resources. And then other times people are just disrespectful. They speak to me any kind of way because I don't perform and I don't demonstrate whiteness. And so it's important for you to think about what your fears and your resources are, because these are your hot spots. Often when you're asking, like, how do I take this work to action? You're asking someone else to tell you how to do something. In truth, you are a full-grown up. You're a full-grown adult. And so you can determine action steps for yourself in your life. But the truth is that the fire that is inside that is keeping you is fear. And it's the fear of losing resources. And until you understand that fear, you will not be able to move into the action space. And so the price of being driven by your fears and your resources are you sacrifice your integrity. So you walk around saying, "I'm a good person. I had good intentions," but you don't have any action. And so good for whom? You have poor retention within your department. People leave. You can't keep anybody of color or any other marginalized person. You see public ruptures, like I said, private support. And who is that support really for? If you privately support someone, is it really for them? That's integrity issues. You see a decline in your health. You get more colds. We know the common cold is associated with discrimination and other navigation of racism. You see decreased work satisfaction, burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. And lastly, you see a lot of justified and perpetuated trauma. And what I mean are things like, well, when I was hired, I had to go through ... So this person has to, these rites of passage that are really trauma and that are harmful and lacking of humanity. But we justify it because we're driven by our own fears and resources, and we're trying to control someone else, and we're not looking within. And so what we do is we do a lot of them, a lot of blaming. We do a lot of institutional racism. Hey, we dismantle that. Institutional racism. You are an institution. I am an institution. Every space that I navigate with groups of people is an institution. And if I don't call those things out, I perpetuate the ways that that institution is toxic. I am responsible. I have power. You have power. And the more that you recognize that individual power, you will be able to connect interpersonally with someone else's power. And then collectively, that is institutional change. And so the truth of this work is you're not going to get any special ally cookies. You know, no one's going to give you any awards. I haven't gotten one, and I'm hundreds of presentations in here. You're not going to get any special praise because this is humanitarian work. This is the work of being a better human to other humans. And so when I talk about this cultural consciousness wave where we started, what I'm talking about is this constant awareness and investigation that happens in our society, but yet we don't cross the bias boundary. We don't cross that space of really what it means to reduce racism, prejudice, and bias in our workplace, in our schools, in our societies, in our groups, at our dinner table, the institution of your household, the institution of your family. And so when you think about action steps and moving this work from just awareness and being able to point it out and be like, look at that racism over there, racism right here, bias and prejudice right here. What I'm talking about is being able to then do something about those fears and to be willing to sacrifice some resources for the sake of integrity, authenticity, value-driven, in a more mindful way. What do I mean? What does it look like? You know, the truth is we're exhausted. We're all time impoverished. It's exhausting having fears. And many of you maybe are already sick, of racism in this country. I had predicted by February, this cultural consciousness wave will crash. But then, we're still living at home. And so, working from home, working in our homes. And so we had a couple of additional racist issues that occurred that got national news. We had the trial. And so that kept people in the game a little bit. But if you think about the exhaustion of waiting for that verdict, that I swear they said it was going to be at 3:30 and it was like 3:59. It's exhausting. It's so exhausting affectively, behaviorally, cognitive, and physically. And so recognizing that exhaustion means recognizing that bias, prejudice, and racism, that exhaustion, those ways that our affective, behavioral, cognitive, and physical activation impacts us, is recognizing that those experiences, those triggers are barriers to our empathy. I'm too tired sometimes to care. It's a barrier to our humanity. And so what letup is a system to help you internally regulate those fears, to help you understand what is activating you. So then you can move from your mind being so full of all of the noise of racism, prejudice, and bias, and what's going to happen if I say this in a meeting, and I don't know what to say, and my heart is beating fast, and my throat is so dry, and I wish I would have said it, and I'm laying it, all of that noise, right? It's a lot of noise. To being able to regulate, to slow it down, to finally accessing the skills you already have. And your skills may be different from mine. We don't have the same skills. Thank goodness for innovation. Thank goodness for different skill sets. And so what letup looks like, and I'll use it, I'll use this example that I recently had where someone who was in a really high leadership role and is a white person, a white man, told me that he just learned about systemic racism, and he had been in this leadership role for years, and works primarily with people of color as the service that he provides in his business. And it was really activating. And I was just like, should I read this person? Should I tell him what I think? And it made me mad and it made me sad, specifically as a psychologist thinking about his organization having the power to take and recommend children be taken from their families, right? And so letup, I have to ask myself, what activates me about this situation? And my goal is to really be able to hear this person, but I can't hear him until I hear myself and my own experience and my own activation. And so my fear in this is like, what does it mean for me as a Black woman to confront this white man in this leadership position? What does it mean for me as a parent to see, other parents suffering in these ways from a system that I think may be anchored in racism, prejudice, and bias? And then the next piece is empathizing with that hurt, that history, that pain, that body that I live in that has generations of being disrespected, of being humiliated, of not being honored. And so I sit with that for a moment. And the more practice I have with it, that moment is like microseconds, right? And so I sit with that and I breathe, and then I recognize that a lot of my activation, those affective, behavioral, cognitive, physical reactions are anchored in the system of racism, prejudice, and bias. And so then I decide, what am I going to say? Because I'm not going to not say anything. Now we're starting to get a little bit closer to action. Am I going to tell my story and I'm going to prepare for a strategic self-disclosure? Am I going to teach this person something? And I have to decide that. Often people of color, Black people, marginalized people are in the position of teaching. And so that navigation is where you start to being able to move from your mind being so full to being more mindful. So you may use an I statement, and it may look something like, as I'm hearing you talk about your journey of learning, as a Black woman who studies racism, prejudice, and bias, it really scares me that you are so new in your journey. And I'm also excited that you're finally on this journey. And hearing this conversation makes me want to invite you to think about the ways that you can be accountable for your own learning. And so I understand the next piece is the you. I have to reflect on my larger role. He's not just having a conversation with me, Dana. He's having a conversation with me and all my history. He's also having a conversation with all the future Black people he may talk to about this topic. And he's also having a conversation with the white people that he'll reflect and say, oh, I just had this conversation with Dr. Crawford and da-da-da-da-da. So I have to understand all of those pieces as I think about my action steps. And then the last piece is making a plan or providing psychoeducation. And again, that depends on your expertise. It may make it very clear that whatever that person is saying isn't helpful. isn't healthy, or it may be a very clear stance that that is racism. And even though that may not be your intention, it does have an impact, and it makes it feel as if I do not belong in this space. And if that was not your intention, we should really think about a plan to change the ways that you're engaging with me, as well as other people of color. And so that's letup, and it requires a lot of practice. You know, for some of us, you might just be on the you may just be listening and empathizing, but the more you do it, it gives you some structure to quiet the noise that is so often associated with the pain of navigating racism, prejudice, and bias. And so the goal is really, in short, to move from your mind being so full to being able to be mindful and access your skills. And so that requires an honesty that many times we don't have in the workplace. An honesty that is painful. It's sort of like extrapolating a bullet that has been lodged in there for years that causes an ache. We just get used to not using our arm. But instead, we got to go in there and dig that thing out. And we have to be honest, not just about oppression. So many of these spaces in the workplace become spaces, I would dare say, to be provocative, of trauma porn, where marginalized people come in and they share their stories, and then white people or people with other privileged identities, cisgender folks and other privileged identities, are silent to make sure they create space for the story. I don't know a single marginalized person that says, you know what my goal is? I want to go to that DEI training and only hear from people of color talking about all of their suffering. At this point, there's a lot of stories of suffering out there. I want to hear from people who have privilege and the ways that they are going to dismantle the systems they've created. And so what does that look like? You know, it's about empowerment. We can no longer view institutional racism as this. We have to start seeing ourselves as institutions. And if we see ourselves as institutions, we then become empowered to change institutions. What power do you have if you view an institution as not part of you? And so what are the things you need to do individually? After you do that after you do that fear and resources investigation, you're going to ask yourself these three questions, these three domains. On an individual level, what do you need to do differently? Interpersonally, what support do you need? And what support can you offer? Institutionally, what policies and practices uphold the current system? And you may sit down as an individual and do this, or you may sit down as a team or with a partner and actually write this down and really start to get systematic about this process, not just watch some asynchronistic learning and be like, oh, now I know systemic racism. Honey, it's going to be more than that. And then you're going to develop an action plan for yourself. Similar to if you were aiming to engage in a healthier lifestyle, you would decide what your diet is, how often you would exercise, what type of exercise. You would make a plan. And so if your plan is to reduce bias, you got to make an actual plan. And this is just a sample plan on an individual level. Maybe you need to learn more about the API community. I love the book Yellow Fever. Maybe interpersonally, you need to understand the ways that anti-Blackness shows up in other communities. And so maybe you'll discuss anti-Blackness with a friend, emphasize friend, someone who actually thinks you're their friend too. You may have that conversation with a friend. Institutionally, I've seen many institutions create systems of reporting of microaggressions. Great. Even better is a system that actually creates a space to talk about those microaggressions and then what you're going to do to dismantle them and train and change and hold each other accountable, not in a punitive way, but accountable for change. And so I want to be clear, you know, I have said in this talk that we are all infected with racism, prejudice, and bias. And some may even argue that people of color can't be racist. I think that may have been the case many years ago. But as we have a redistribution of resources through technology and many other things, I think we are all infected with this STD. And we all have work to do, but it's not the same work. And so people with socially oppressed identities, and this is the work of Resman Menakem that talks about socially oppressed identities and socially privileged identities. People with socially oppressed identities, this work may look like naming racism, prejudice, and bias, healing, and not taking care of other people, not rescuing people from their insights. You allow people to suffer through this pain of getting this STD out of their body. And really being responsible for not saying yes to every DEI committee, not every talk, but really taking care of your Black body, your body of color, your marginalized, your LGBTQIA body. You know, I would dare say taking care of the marginalized body is a revolutionary act. And then for those with socially privileged identities, it's dismantling, it's validating with action, not with just words. It's taking risk. It's being willing to lose some resources and redistribute resources, and it's being accountable. And so we all got work to do, but my work is not the same as your work. And so the other things we really have to do, and I'm going to wrap up so we have time for Q&A, is number one, we really have to stop teaching DEI 101. For a number of reasons. Number one is that we're so far along in the field of DEI or DEIB is that nobody ever needs to teach this again. Like, you actually don't need a human to teach you because there's enough information in the world, and you can literally just Google DEI for beginners and you will get a plethora of resources. So nobody at this point should be educating you. It's sort of like, if our goal from New York is to drive to California, we cannot just keep crossing the bridge over and over and over again. We have to start driving across the country. The second is, it's really harmful for people who've experienced injustices for years, for decades, for centuries, for you to just come along and say, hey, I just learned about this thing. Because as you're asking them to explain the basics, it's similar to, again, be very provocative in my metaphors, to someone who had been raped multiple times and then to come along and ask them to define what the definition of rape is. That is harmful. That is deplorable. We have to move past it. And lastly, if we keep teaching 101, no one's going to change. We're not going to get innovative. The field needs to go. We need to start imagining what a new world looks like, where whiteness is not the standard, where heterosexuality is not the standard, where able body is not the standard, but instead we get creative and playful. We have a crisis of imagination and a crisis of innovation in this country. And if that wants to change, we got to stop starting over again. And then lastly, this work is not going to be enough. You can't come to a talk and think that you're going to be a bias reductionist. You have to do this action work that I'm talking about. You have to talk to your colleagues in between all of your DEI sessions, and you have to develop this really serious plan. And then you have to check in about it with SMART goals level. Like, where am I? What do I need to do differently? Where is it moving? I mean, you have to revise it and update it. And whew, I said a lot of words. This is exhausting. But recognizing how exhausting it is really has to recognize the humanitarian work here. That there is no label, no slogan, no party, no skin color, no religion that's more important than your humanity. You only live once, depending on your belief system. And if you live more than once, you have work to do in this lifetime. And so the goal is to build stamina. If you were running a marathon, you wouldn't just give up. Instead, you would get some water and you would prepare for the next mile. And so now we need to prepare for that next stage. I hope that this work has inspired you in some ways that you can build your stamina. This QR code is a 30-second survey. If we were in person, you might boo me or you might applaud, and then I would get some feedback. And so since I'm like talking in the ether, this QR code, if you choose to do it, is just a way to give me a bit of an applause or some feedback in ways that I can improve my own action plan. Thank you for your precious time.
Thank you, Dr. Crawford, for this amazing presentation. I know we don't have a lot of time to answer all of the questions that have been asked in the chat, but I do want to ask one specific question that has come through. There have been a number of kind of ways this question has been asked throughout the chat, and so I think it's a really great one, though, as Aries pointed in this particular question. As a non-cis person with a white male body, I have chosen to stay back so I wouldn't step on people with more right to speak on the DEI topic at hand. So how can I be sure I'm not trampling on someone else and exercising privilege when I speak up in a DEI context?
Mm-hmm. So I think number one, great job identifying all your identities. You better list them all out. I see you. So you get a little star for that. But I think the other piece is having reverence. So it's asking permission to speak in that space in a real way, not in a like, hey, can I go? And then you already speaking. It's a real invitation that someone may decline. Like, may I please speak? And no, actually, let's allow someone else to reflect. The other thing is when you speak in these spaces, to speak specifically from your privileged identities and the ways that that impacts others and the ways that that gets perpetuated and your fears related to your resources and what you're going to do about it, I think becomes really critical.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that question. We have another question here from Liz Frank. So, Dr. Crawford, how can we engage and create collaborations with our corporate leaders and hiring teams to face this head on? I attend events like this filled with members of the choir preaching to those who already agree with the discourse. And then this person specifically wrote sigh.
Yeah. I think the piece about having an action plan becomes really critical. And so I have found as a member of the preaching choir that we may not give a plan. You know, I've been to many talks that no one's ever actually broke down what I should have in the plan. What does it mean to have SMART goals? What are our measurable goals? And then as you collectively come together with other members of your choir in your department, in your division, in your office, to then bring those demands and to bring those in multiple spaces. So in my annual review to say, I want these to be considered as part of my goals. I want everyone in our office to have this as part of our goals. It's also about transparency. And so what does it mean to have a call to action, a commitment to action? And one of the things that I love about Zuckerman is it's on our website. These are the things that we're striving for. This is our board coming together. Sometimes it is going to be a sacrifice of time. And so that may mean that rather than having that Zoom happy hour to build rapport, you may actually have to have that Zoom working group to talk about what are you going to do to dismantle racism. And when people don't show up, the truth of the matter is some people will be left behind. If enough people decide to have actionable steps on an individual level, an interpersonal level, and then interpersonally connect, then people will have to come on board, or they will start to have little conflicts within the office. They will start to feel left behind. It's the ways that all systems change. You know, I think about many systems change by a group of people, a small group starting, and then others joining. And there are late adopters in groups. I think it's also crucial that you ask, why don't you come to these spaces? Invite not just the choir to these spaces, but people who are naysayers. I love to have somebody who comes and they're like, oh, I don't really think DEI is important. Oh, come to my group and say that there so we can talk about those spaces. We've come to this space in this country that we're so siloed that we barely even have a tolerance for someone to have a dissenting belief. Either you're kumbaya, all DEI, or like you're terrible. And so this space of contempt has to stop. We have to start figuring out ways that we can connect and invite more dialogue and reflection across from the choir, I would dare say, to the congregation, if we're going with the metaphor.
I 100% agree. Thank you for answering that question. I think we have time maybe for one or two more, but the next question I want to ask you comes from Danielle. And Danielle asks, what would you recommend for an organization to do as they begin their DEIB work?
Wow. I think the first piece, I don't know, because I don't know your organization. I would start with why. Why are you doing this DEIB work? What is it about for you? What is the motivation? So many times people are driven by the shoulds, by the cultural consciousness wave, and the shoulds are not sustainable. The cultural consciousness wave is not sustainable. Your system will get tired and exhausted, and then it will be done. What are the resources that are not being addressed, that are not being accessed by not having DEIB? What is getting lost? And many organizations are very clear on that. I just spoke to a group yesterday and they were like, yes, we're all people of color working with all patients of, we're all white people and we're working with all patients of color. And we know that. And that was the end of it, And so recognizing the motivation for the work is the first step. The next is to really lay out just a few goals. What are some things that we can do in this first quarter, our second quarter, our third quarter? And I think the other piece is developing pipelines. So many times there is not enough building of the next generation of employees. And so I think every single system for every intervention should be asking two questions. How do we sustain this work? And what is our pipeline plan to feed in new talents, new innovation, and really important changing knowledge?
Awesome. Well, that does conclude our time together. So I do want to thank each and every one of you all who are watching this, whether it's on LinkedIn, on Facebook, or as part of our Inclusive Excellence Summit here at Cornell University. So thank you all. And then thank you especially to Dr. Dana Crawford for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good one, everyone.